Good evening. I'm Alfred Lemon, the director of the Reynolds Research Center. On behalf of the board and staff of the collection, I would like to welcome you to our annual Francisco Bouligny Lecture. Established in 2003 by the descendants of Francisco Bouligny, one of the last Spanish governors of Louisiana, the lecture is designed to promote the study of Spanish Louisiana and its context. We are very pleased to welcome Felipe Fernández-Armesto, the William P. Reynolds Professor of History of the University of Notre Dame. His publications and honors are numerous, and he is considered a pioneer in the field of global history. Although he is asked that I not focus on his achievements, I feel I should note that in 2017, he was the recipient of the Grand Cross of the Order of Alfonso el Sabio, Spain's highest honor for contributions to science, scholarship, education, and the arts. It is indeed a distinct honor for the collection to host him. This evening's presentation is made possible by the Embassy of Spain in Washington and with the support of the agency, Spain, Arts and Culture. I would like to kindly ask that all of us turn off our cell phones and other technological devices. And finally, ladies and gentlemen, Professor Fernández. Thank
you. Well, thank you very much, Alfred, and thank you for having me. It's a great treat to be able to get back to New Orleans and to take part in this very eminent series of lectures, looking back over who's given them before. I feel that I'm the most unworthy lecturer so far. I'm very grateful to the historic collection, everybody here, especially Alfred, who had a terrible job coordinating the logistics of my visit, and Francis and Justin and Amanda, also to the Spanish Embassy and the cultural section, especially Maria Molina de Alvarez de Toledo, and of course to the Bouligny Foundation, and to all of you for being here. As you can tell from the way I speak English, I was educated, if you can call it that, in the United Kingdom, where, you know, we're taught always to begin by trying to attract the sympathy of the audience with a few self-deprecatory remarks about our own ignorance. Indeed, the story is told of a PhD student who did his doctorate with us in Oxford, and who, on returning to his native Germany, began his first lecture by saying, I do beg your pardon, ladies and gentlemen, but I really know very little about this subject, whereupon the audience got up and left. So if you feel so inclined, this is probably the moment, because I want to confess my ignorance of the history of New Orleans and Louisiana. I'm quite sure that everybody here knows far more about that than I do. So my job here is really to introduce a few contextual elements within which the history of this part of the world can perhaps be better appreciated. Elements focused on the history of empire. You know, what really interests me about empires, how does it happen at all? Now, especially in pre-industrial times, when no state, and especially not the Spanish state, God forbid, no state really had the resources of manpower, of technology, of sheer, you know, cash to impose, even indeed to communicate its will to most of its subjects, especially in a vast empire like that of Spain. And really Spain's, well, monarchy, as the Spaniards themselves called it in those days, is really the model example with which to approach this problem, because it was the biggest such empire. Indeed, You know, in terms of ecological and cultural diversity, it was by a long way the biggest empire the world had ever seen, and therefore correspondingly harder to manage than any other empire. And I want to focus this evening on 18th century North America, not only in a desperate attempt to appeal to my audience and to follow the tradition of the Bouligny Lectures, but also because 18th century North America is the example that most dramatically emphasizes these problems. Because if you think about it, ladies and gentlemen, you know that in the 18th century the Spanish monarchy was supposedly in decline, at least in relative decline compared with the new rising empires with which Spain was competing in this part of the world. And you also know, if you think about it, I mean, people don't often think about this, but everybody knows that the Spanish Empire in North America outlasted all its rivals. You know, if you think about it, the French Empire disappeared from continental North America in 1763. And the British Empire disappeared from the territory of what is now the United States in 1782, but the Spanish Empire kept going for nearly half a century beyond that, in spite of its relative deficiency of resources. And it actually saw off these, and as we shall see, other competitors. And the problem that I want to put before you is, how was that possible? How did the Spaniards pull off this trick? Well, my own interest in this subject really began a few years ago here, in the place that you see before you on the screen, which I'm sure you will recognize as the United States Air Force Academy, Colorado Springs. I was there a few years ago to give some lectures. I regret to say that lectures are the only motive of my travels. No one ever wants me for any other purpose. And there I was, and the Air Force very kindly assigned this young lieutenant to kind of look after me whilst I was there. He was very nice, well-educated, well-brought up, young man of broad culture and sympathies, who even told me that he was in favor of immigration, which I thought was very big of him, considering I was sort of immigrant myself. And you know, earlier today I was giving a lecture at the Cabrini High School. As you know, Mother Cabrini is the patron saint of immigrants. Well, this young man was in favor of immigration. Oh, he also called himself a liberal. And you know, the Air Force Academy has quite a conservative reputation, so I thought that was pretty audacious of him as well. The only thing, he said to me, is that when people come to this country, he said, they should learn the native language. And I didn't think he meant Ute or Comanche. So I agreed with him, and I said, yes, quite right, everybody should be made to learn Spanish. And he looked at me rather strangely for a moment, and I said, excuse me, what is the name of this state? And since we were in Colorado, the debate ended at that point. But you know, this experience alerted me to the fact that in this country, even, you know, well-brought up, well-educated, liberal-minded, soi-disant liberals who are in favor of immigration don't know the profundity of the Hispanic past of what is now United States territory. Don't know, for example, that, you know, Spanish was spoken in the territory of what is now the United States for fully a century before the first English-speaking colonies were established. And I'm just going to give you one example of what I think is an illustration of the depth of the Hispanic penetration of United States culture, which is this. And I make no apology, you know, for showing you an illustration from graphic fiction, from popular culture, because the United States, you know, say what you like about it and who doesn't, the United States is a democracy. You know, in this country, you build culture from below, not like us in Europe, where, you know, the aristocracy have really determined the standards that everybody else has to follow. So if you want to know your own country, study its popular culture. You know, study its movies, its graphic novels, its pulp fiction. And of course, the purpose of this illustration is to demonstrate, well, first of all, the obvious similarities between Zorro and the Lone Ranger. The Lone Ranger is, let's face it, an Anglo rip-off of Zorro. Indeed, all American superheroes, if you want to understand America, you've got to look at the superheroes, right? I mean, they're the ideals that, you know, the youth, the people whom I teach in my regular day job. They're the guys who represent for them the models of behavior. And they're all the same. All those superheroes are basically the same. They're all these marginal characters who seek justice from the margins of society. They're all masked, you know, and they all activate their superpowers by putting their masks on. The only exception being Superman, who of course takes his glasses off. But that's basically the same gesture, right, but just in reverse. I've tried it many times, it never seems to work. The point is that all of these guys are derived from the model of Zorro. And when Johnson Macaulay invented the character of Zorro at the beginning of the last century, he based it on the legendary social bandit Joaquin Murrieta, who, ironically, was a hero of California resistance against the United States. And I do find it amusing and ironic that this whole superhero tradition is based on a Hispanic character. Well, I don't want to waste your time on a lot more examples, but I mean, everybody knows that to some extent this history of, you know, Hispanic formative influence in this country goes back to the 16th century, to places like this is San Agustin in Florida, founded, as everybody knows, 1565, or Santa Fe in New Mexico, 1598. But in order to understand this, I think we have to grasp two things. The first is that overwhelmingly, the way the Hispanic past got embedded in the territory of what is now the United States was really an 18th century phenomenon. And it was, to a great extent, not the result. I mean, I've got to admit that it was not the result of most of what I'm going to talk about today, which was, I mean, I'm going to talk about politics and war. But we have to acknowledge that to a great extent, the reasons why there are cultural continuities that embrace the Rio Grande, and which you find in the United States and other parts of the Americas further to the south, the part of the reason for that is actually environmental. And you can see that if you look at these environmental maps of the Americas, and you can see two things immediately about the history of this hemisphere from looking at these maps. The first is the reason why North America is different from the rest, and that's basically because of this vast boreal extension to the north, which doesn't exist in the rest of the Americas. Whereas in the south, you've got this, we've got all this, these tropical and subtropical zones which don't exist in North America. So that's the main reason for the differences. But you can also see the main reason for the continuities and similarities, which is also ecological. It's to do with the fact that many of these areas, particularly the arid, mountain, and temperate areas, are reproduced. You find the equivalents in both moieties of the hemisphere. And where you have environmental continuities and similarities, you have cultural continuities and similarities. I'm not an environmental determinist. I think you have to understand these things as mutually formative. but you can't escape the conditioning and limiting influence of the environment. And I'll just give you a couple of examples, very briefly, which represent economic culture, which is, of course, the kind of culture which is most susceptible to environmental influence. For example, here's an example of economic culture from northern Mexico, from Chihuahua. And here's an example of economic culture from southern Missouri, which is environmentally remarkably similar. And I know you won't believe me, ladies and gentlemen, but I promise you that I can no longer remember which of these images was photographed in Idaho and which in Peru. Because you can see that the kind of activities that people engaged in are identical. And the landscape is identical. It's because of the environmental similarities that you have those continuities. Now, I want to turn now to what I really want to talk about, which is the politics and warfare, because you can see here that if you look at the latest census information that we have from the United States, you can see how the areas which are most densely populated by self-identifying Hispanics nowadays are precisely those areas which formed part of the Spanish monarchy in the 18th century. This is really the starting point for appreciating the role of the Spanish monarchy in the 18th century in the formation of what has become the United States. The Spanish monarchy in this part of the world, in what is now the United States, reached its greatest extent in September 1796, when the last great Spanish explorer, the person I would characterize as the last great Spanish explorer of the Americas, made this map in North Dakota, having just raised the banner of the Spanish monarchy over the main village of the Mandan Indians. This is a slightly later image, 1834, of that culture. Now, this Spanish explorer, Juan Evans, was an agent of the Missouri Company and of the King of Spain, who had been sent out along the upper Missouri, really partly in order to frustrate the new kind of unholy alliance between Britain and the United States, the Jay Treaty, in which those two countries conspired to prevent the further expansion of the Spanish monarchy northwards. And his instructions were to find a route to the Pacific. He was going to make an alliance with the Mandans, who were supposedly the most civilized indigenous people of the region, and then he was supposed to go and find a new route to the Pacific. In other words, this was an exact prefiguration of the commission that Lewis and Clark subsequently undertook. But Juan Evans's real motive for accepting this commission was quite different from what the Spanish monarchy intended. Because you can see, ladies and gentlemen, there's something rather odd about this map, right? That if I go back to the map, you can see that all the legends are written not in Spanish, but in English and French. And that's because although this Spanish explorer was Spanish in the sense that he was recently naturalized, he was really not Juan Evans, but John Evans, a Welsh nationalist renegade who took service with the Spanish crown in order to spite those bloody English. And he was part of a sodality of Welsh nationalists whose aim was Welsh independence of Britain. Or, if that were not possible, which obviously it wasn't, to found a new independent Wales in America, beyond the reach of the British Empire. That was his motive for joining the Spaniards. And specifically, he wanted this job of doing this incredible journey to the Mandan Indians because amongst his fellow Welsh nationalists, there was nourished a myth that in the Middle Ages, in the 12th century, a completely fictitious, legendary, non-existent Welsh prince, supposedly called Madoc, had journeyed across the ocean and founded an empire in a distant land to the west. And his object was to find the proof that this phantom empire had really existed, and the proof, he believed, as did other Welsh nationalists in his circle, was that the Mandan Indians were the descendants of Madoc's subjects and that they spoke Welsh. Now, I love this, ladies and gentlemen, because isn't this great, you know? This is the last great explorer of the Spanish Empire in the Americas, and he's still doing, in 1796, you know, what all those crazy conquistadores had done, who were, you know, looking for the terrestrial paradise and the fountain of youth and the Amazons and the cities of Cibola and the cities of the Massacres. This search, you know, for a mythic, non-existent past is still going on, right up to the very eve of the disappearance of the Spanish monarchy in the Americas. Well, obviously, this expedition was a failure because although he raised the flag, the Mandans joined the Spanish monarchy, it was an unsustainably remote frontier, and eventually he had to give up, and he went back to Philadelphia, and he wrote this rather sad letter to his fellow Welsh nationalists saying that unfortunately these guys didn't speak Welsh, and they probably had to start the search all over again elsewhere. This culminating moment when the Spanish monarchy reached its greatest extent in North America came at the end of a century of advance and progress on the Spanish monarchy's part, starting in the 1690s with the reconquest of New Mexico, from which, as you know, the Spaniards had been virtually expelled by a so-called indigenous uprising in 1680. In the 1690s, they, in inverted commas, reconquered New Mexico, founded a lot of new settlements like this is Santa Cruz de la Cañada, founded 1693, well to the north of their previous frontier. And that effort of reconquering New Mexico imposed on the monarchy the necessity of forging a remoter frontier for the security of their newly won territories. And that's why, for example, you find these heroic expeditions being sent into the prairies in search of indigenous allies to secure the frontier. The story very much reminds me of the story of the Roman frontier in Europe, this indefensibly long, strategically bizarre line across the map, which was literally indefensible, but which imposed upon the Romans the duty of trying to sustain it. And the same sort of thing happens in the Americas, where, you know, just think about it, the Spaniards are trying to defend a frontier across practically the widest part of North America, certainly south of the Boreal North. And here you can see one of those expeditions depicted in this precious document, a painting on hide, which is now in the State Historian Museum of New Mexico. A painting painted in 1719 by native Pawnee artists. So the Spaniards had gone trying to make allies of the Pawnee and the Wichita, and here you can see what happened. Here are the Spaniards, and here are all the Pawnee shooting them with arrows. This was an expedition of 40 Spaniards. It was a failure, but it's representative of the sort of efforts the monarchy was making, which to some extent achieved some success in 1730 when they made an alliance with the Ute, which did relieve some of the pressure on their New Mexico frontier. And they also extended, of course, into Arizona. Here's a famous mission of San Javier de Bac. This is what it looks like now. It's pretty much as it looked from 1782 onwards. Meanwhile, they were struggling, you know, to pacify this long frontier in what is now Texas. engaged in long, bloody war against the Caddo natives, complicated in the 1750s by the eruption of the Comanche. Here we see one of the most famous episodes, the martyrdom of the Franciscans of San Saba in 1758. The Franciscans wouldn't accept a garrison to protect them, like many other missions, and the result was that they were massacred by the Comanche, after which the mission was rebuilt in stone at terrible cost and great suffering. And here we see, this is Florida. Whilst these heroic efforts were going on in Arizona, New Mexico, the Spaniards were also maintaining this extraordinary series of outposts in Florida, in missions that were virtually ungarrisoned. I mean, all the Spanish troops in Florida were on the edges of the peninsula, because what interested the monarchy in Florida was the preservation of the harbors, because the Gulf Stream leads past Florida. They had to keep those harbors out of enemy hands. So it was a kind of lost leader. They never made money out of Florida. Here's, well, I don't need to tell you what this is. I do think it's very amusing for a Spaniard like me to come to what you call the French Quarter and see this kind of stuff. But in a way, you know, it's entirely appropriate because, as you know very well, in a way, the configuration of the French Quarter owes much more to the period when it was under Spanish dominion than it does to that of the French. And of course, in a way, the Spanish acquisition of Louisiana, management of French Louisiana after the 7 Years' War was one of the great success stories of the Spanish monarchy, because unlike the French, they did manage to introduce, you know, some colonial population into the territory. And of course, they vastly increased, as you know, under Spanish rule. The traffic via New Orleans increased fourfold in this really relatively short space of time. And then they were also colonizing California from Upper California, California in the United States, from 1769 onwards. And I show you this image because, again, it has a certain amusement value. These are the old Spanish days that are celebrated every year in Santa Barbara, California. A place where the Hispanic heritage is so deeply felt that even the Unitarian Church is built in the Hispanic revival style. And here you see, I mean, obviously this is in a way a rather silly pastiche, but you know, it shows you the depth of feeling with which people identify with the Spanish past in Santa Barbara. And in order to be a guest of honor at the barbecue with which the old Spanish days culminates every year, you have to be a descendant of the garrison of the 18th century Spanish presidio. Something which causes me the utmost amusement, because can you imagine what sort of person you had to be in the garrison of the Spanish presidio of Santa Barbara at the end of the day? I mean, this was the butt of the world. Yeah? And you wouldn't go there if you had any reason to be anywhere else. You know, these guys were all desperados and criminals. But, you know, they've become the ancestors of the sort of local aristocracy of Santa Barbara. And obviously, oh, well, here's a map of Florida as it was when the British took it over briefly in 1763. But you know, Florida only passed out of Spanish hands for diplomatic reasons. The Spanish were never defeated in Florida in spite of the fact that they had virtually no garrisons there. And the British hurled, you know, tremendous resources in the effort to conquer Florida in the 18th century, and they could never succeed, largely because the native American population remained loyal to the Spanish crown. And then, of course, this is the Battle of Pensacola. This is the nearest I'm going to come, I suppose, to talking about Bouligny, because, of course, he was present in this battle. And this represents the greatest victory of the Spanish in North America in the 18th century, a great victory over the British, the victory which really sealed the fate of the British in this part of the world. So by this date, I mean, we've come to the end of what you call the Revolutionary War. The Spanish have seen off the French, and they've seen off the British. And in all that, in spite of the fact that they seem to have had practically nothing to do it with. Here you can see, this is, of course, in what is now Louisiana. This is the fort of Nuestra Señora de los Alayes, where when the Marqués de Rubí conducted his visitation of Spanish fortifications on the frontier in 1766, he discovered that for a garrison supposedly of 60 men, they had 10 muskets. And this was a key defensive point that had been, absolutely critical in defense of Spanish North America against the French. And in all of these, we're talking about thousands of miles of frontier defended by extremely exiguous forces. And every time a Spanish visitation takes place, you read in the reports the same kind of complaints. I'm just going to read you one brief extract from the report on one fortress by Pedro de Rivera, who conducted one of these visitations in 1724. And he says that he found that the forts lacked everything needful, both for equipment and sustenance, as well as what was necessary to defend the place, the soldiers being far fewer than the king paid for, because this is another theme of these reports, the corruption of the captains who pocketed the pay of soldiers who didn't exist, and utterly unworthy of the designation of soldiers. And in spite of this, not only have the Spaniards seen off the French and the Spanish, but also you've got to take into account the context in which Spanish power is being progressively eroded. Now, the Spaniards had lost by this date command of the Pacific, which in the 17th century had been a Spanish lake, as Oscar Spate called it. It was a Spanish lake no longer because the French, the British, and the Russians, had all penetrated it, established bases. They were all after what they often referred to as scientific knowledge, but really they were obviously after the resources of the Pacific, especially the whale fishery, which was crucial to the global economy. This was the main source of lipids for the world in the 18th century. And here you can see, for example, this caricature concerns the British New South Wales Company, which was an attempt to wrest the whale fishery of the Pacific from other hands. Here you can see what's happening in continental North America at the same time. This is the fort of Pittsburgh. In the 1750s, the British move inland what had previously been virtually a seaboard empire becomes a land empire with the colonization of the Ohio Valley. And of course, the same thing is going on with the French in Louisiana at the time. So the Spaniards are being subjected to new pressures from rival empires that had never before threatened their heartlands in the interior of the continent. And it's not only these European empires that they're confronting, they're also confronting indigenous empires. Because ladies and gentlemen, imperialism is not just a white vice. Unfortunately, it's a human vice, and there were indigenous empires that were strictly comparable with European ones in terms of resources in this period. I'm showing you here the master example, which is the Mapuche Empire of the southern Pampas. And here you can see, oh my God, I'm sorry. Here you can see the leaders, that's Cacapol el Bravo, this is his son, Cangapol. And you can, these were horse-borne empires very like those of the Mongols or in Asia or the Oromo in Africa. And if you don't believe that they were genuinely states of imperial dimensions, think of the example of the Comanche leader Cuerno Verde. The Comanche they could field armies of 40,000 men. They had 120,000 horses in their corrals. And here are some lines which are placed by the writer in the mouth of Cuerno Verde in a dramatic performance which was shown in the principal theater of Santa Fe, New Mexico in 1783. And you can see here that the Spaniards regarded the Comanche Empire as an empire like theirs. I'm sure everybody here knows enough Spanish to understand this. I'll briefly translate it for you. From east to west, from the south to the cold north, the brilliant sound of my trumpet sounds, and my steel reigns. Among all nations, I make war boldly, daringly. The valor which reigns in my breast is so great that my banners rise with the wind round and about over all those on whom I have levied tribute. So, the Spaniards are acknowledging this as a genuinely imperial state. But of course, as you know, as you've seen from the previous slide, the Spaniards defeated Cuerno Verde in 1779, captured this vast treasure that the Comanches had accumulated. The accounts vary, but something like 140 mule loads of treasure went back to Santa Fe from the defeat of Cuerno Verde. It reminds me of Einhardt's description of Charlemagne defeating the Avars and taking the treasures of the Avar ring back to Aachen. And as a result of that victory, the Spaniards were able to make peace with the Comanche and turn them into allies against their common Apache enemies. And here you can see a report of a battle in 1786 between the Comanche and the Apache, and the Comanche are reporting back to Juan de Anza, whose signature you see down there. So by this date, the Spaniards have also seen off their rival indigenous empire. And you have to ask how it was done. And in order to understand that, I refer you to the archive assembled by this man. And I'm sure everybody recognizes Hubert Bancroft, who was this great publisher who made a fortune in California and devoted a lot of it after the Civil War to building up a tremendous archive of the history of the western part of the United States, the Pacific coastal zones. And not only did he collect documents, he also collected oral testimonies. In a way, he was a bit like General Williams, and the origins of this great collection, to me, have something, reminiscent of Bancroft's endeavors. But of course, Bancroft just did it on a vast scale. And in 1870, I'm going to say 1877, don't persecute me if I'm a couple of years out. I'm an historian, I've got no sense of dates. Anyway, let's put it like this. Late in the 1870s, Bancroft sent this young journalist in his employ, Thomas Savage, to Whiskey Hill, which was a pretty rundown district of San Jose in California, in order to interview this old man. He was allegedly 96 years old, though that may probably have been an exaggeration. So he goes to interview this old guy called Jose Amador, who had been a soldier in the Spanish forces in California in the last days of the empire, from 1809 to 1828. And the interview is, I mean, it's just, it's dazzling and it's heartbreaking. I mean, the data are stunning. But I just want to read you one extract from this. I'm translating this as I go along. Also, I brought the wrong spectacles, so God knows what will happen. I have to explain to you that we don't know the date of this for certain, but this is probably 1828. So the last year of the Spanish Empire in the continental New World. And José Amador is taking part in a punitive expedition to punish some so-called enemy Indians. And he and the other Spaniards are accompanied by indigenous auxiliaries, as he calls them, from a people he calls the Moquelemnes. Well, they do have a battle and they capture all these enemies. And the Moquelemnes come to José Amador, and they're sort of standing around, and he doesn't know what they want. And he says, I asked them what they wanted, and they replied that they wanted justice. Namely, that we should hand over the Christian prisoners so that they could kill them with arrows. The Spaniards didn't want to do this, but for reasons we shall come to, he goes on, we separated from the chain of prisoners 100 Christians, and every half mile, 6 of them went down on their knees to pray the creed, and we made it clear to them that they were about to die. Each of them had 4 archers to kill him, 2 in front and 2 behind. Our commanding officer didn't want to undertake this execution because he didn't have the heart to do it. Porque no tenía ánimo. But I told him, that's José Amador talking, I told him that if my own father had been put up to be killed, I would not have hesitated to do it myself. Seems a horrible, shocking thing to say. But you've got to understand why this was. The Spaniards had no choice. If they'd said to the Moquelemnes, no, we're not going along with this massacre, they would have been massacred. So this was the only way that they could save their own lives. And really, the description is quite frightening because he goes on, so I told him we'd better have them all shot at once, doing it as quickly as possible, but baptizing them first. And he describes how he and another Spaniard, again, they take a bottle of water, and one of them starts at one end of the line and the other starts at the other, and they baptize them all. We baptized all the Indians, and then they were shot in the back. And then the Moquelemnes decide that they're going to go to the village that was where these enemy Indians lived, and they were going to kill the remaining men, and they were going to enslave the women and children. And they do that the following day, and José Amador tells us at daybreak they came back to the camp with 160 women and children, and they'd killed off all the remaining men. And he ends up by saying, these auxiliary Indians were Moquelemnes, very warlike people, very valiant and loyal, and I never had the slightest hesitation in joining them on campaign. Now this rather frightening and harrowing story reminds me very much of episodes, again, right back at the beginning of the Spanish conquest in the New World. The massacres that accompanied the conquest of Mexico, the massacres of Cholula and Tenochtitlan, the feast of Toxcatl. And we can see that these were very similar episodes in which the main roles are, oh my God. I beg your pardon, ladies and gentlemen, I went to college in Oxford, so I don't understand technology. So you can see that it's the natives who are in the forefront of the fray, and everything is being directed by the woman whom the authors of this source, the Lienzo de Tlaxcala, recognize as the real conqueror of Mexico, Doña Marina, Cortes's interpretrix. And you find the same in the other. There she is. Here are the natives really doing most of the massacring. So, you've got to ask, who were the auxiliaries? The Spaniards were much more like auxiliaries than the so-called auxiliaries were themselves. It was the natives who were in charge in episodes like those that I've described to you. And we're talking about a monarchy that succeeded in this part of the world, in spite of its paucity of resources, by placing its fate in the hands of indigenous elites. Indigenous elites in the sense of Native Americans where appropriate, or Creoles in other cases. Which brings us to a duck. Or is it a duck? And I show you this not only to allude to a famous painting of Magritte's, and not chiefly to try and convince you that my lecture has not been, in the other sense of the word, a canard. But because this reminds me of a famous episode during the McCarthyite era, when journalists are supposed to have asked, according to some versions of the story, it's McCarthy himself, some other McCarthyite, how do you tell who's a communist? And the McCarthyite replies, if it looks like a duck, walks like a duck, and quacks like a duck, it's a duck. I think, ladies and gentlemen, that empires are like communists and ducks. They're very hard to define. A few years ago, I was having dinner in Cambridge, Massachusetts, with Christopher Bailey, famous historian of the British Empire, David Armitage, the author of The Intellectual Origins of the British Empire, Leonard Busset, possibly the greatest living authority on the Dutch Empire. And as you can imagine, during dinner, we talked about empires. And of course, being professional academics, we disagreed about everything. Except one thing. There was just one thing that we agreed about, which was that none of us could define an empire. Now just think about that, ladies and gentlemen. You got four guys who are supposedly, the great experts on that. We literally did not know what we were talking about. And I think an empire is difficult, perhaps impossible to define, but like, communists and ducks, you can kind of see it, know it when you see it, because you can profile it. And I just put it to you, ladies and gentlemen, what, in your own minds, what's your profile of an empire? Well, you could mention lots of things, but I'm running out of time, so I'm going to leave the list to you. But I want to suggest to you that one of the things that we typically think is that an empire is a strong, a powerful state. That is the exact opposite of the truth. An empire is typically a weak state. And in the pre-industrial era, such as we've been talking about this evening, it's an almost totally powerless state because, in the case of a monarchy like the Spanish monarchy, it's so vast that the, central authorities can't even communicate their wishes to people, even if those people had been willing, to do what they were told. They wouldn't know what they were supposed to do. So this is a, literally ungovernable empire. And all of these empires are weak in proportion to their size. The bigger they are, the weaker they are at their peripheries. And although they may lay heavy hands on the people at their centers, they stretch feeble fingertips towards their rims. And that's why no pre-industrial empire could work without quislings and collaborators. No pre-industrial empire could work without doing what we've seen the Spaniards doing, putting its fate in the hands of collaborative elites at its periphery. That explains why José Amador says he would have been willing to kill his father. And, largo sensu, I think it helps us understand how the Spaniards achieved the impossible and not only sustained but augmented their monarchy in North America against all the odds in the 18th century. Oh, I was just hoping that I might get away without being asked a question. Sir, yes.
Let's go to the other side of the Atlantic. How conscious were the Spanish crown, I mean the inner circle, of the vastness of his empire? Let's say Carlos III. How much time during the day when he wasn't hunting did he think about this?
Well, thank you very much. That's an excellent question. I think Carlos III thought about his empire an awful lot. And one of the most remarkable things is about that period is Humboldt's remark, and he would know about this, that the Spanish monarchy was the only monarchy that really showed an appreciation of its empire in this period. That's why he decided to go and explore the Spanish Americas with the approval and subvention of the Spanish monarchy. And he talks about how much the Spanish monarchy invested, in the investigation of its territories, not just for the sake of knowing their resources, though that was obviously the main interest of the government. What can you get out of this territory? What can you levy on it by way of taxes? What trade can you promote that might augment the revenues of the crown? But also, according to Humboldt, genuine dispassionate scientific interest. I mean, one of the things that I did a few years ago was take part in the edition of the Diaries of Malaspina, who knows, the sort of Spanish Captain Cook who went off on this great expedition, and these reports, the scientific reports that this expedition generated, occupy scores of volumes, and fill whole rooms of the various museums in Spain. Admittedly, that episode ended tragically, because by the time Malaspina had done all this work and he got back to Spain, the French Revolution had happened. And the Spanish monarchy had kind of lost interest in reforming the empire. And in fact, he was imprisoned and his reports, locked up in the archives. But it is an example of how important the improving their knowledge of this empire was to the Spanish elite. And of course, that was the reign of Charles IV, who wasn't so personally committed, but Charles III certainly was, and he annotated. He wasn't the most zealous monarch, but he annotated a lot of documents about the New World, showing that he personally was very interested in it. Sir?
What was the root cause, really, for all of the transferring back and forth from the French monarchy to the Spanish monarchy in the city of New Orleans?
Going back and forth? Thank you very much. Yes, the question is why. The gentleman asked you what was the root cause. I mean, God knows what the root cause of anything is. God. The gentleman asked, what's the root cause of the way the Mississippi Valley, New Orleans in particular, keeps apparently getting sort of treated like a shuttlecock and going back and forth. Of course, the same is true of Florida. And I mean, almost everywhere. You know, have you ever read that marvelous novel by Malcolm Bradbury, which takes place in a Balkan country, the frontiers of which have so often been changed by diplomatic exchanges between the great powers that it now occupies none of its historic territory. You know, and in the 18th century, this was completely normal. You know, these powers remember, before nationalism, they had no concern with maintaining frontiers other than for their immediate purposes. So in a way, it's entirely normal for these transfers to happen in the 18th century. But of course, as you know far better than I, the French failed in Louisiana. They failed to populate the region. They couldn't get colonists to go and settle in it. They couldn't find ways of exploiting it economically, in spite of being the most populous monarchy in Europe and having a much bigger surplus population than the Spaniards ever had. They couldn't make Louisiana work. And I think one of the main reasons for that is obviously, that from a communications point of view, it wasn't a good place to start from. It was isolated from other parts of the French. Perhaps you don't know the old English joke, ladies and gentlemen, about the motorist who stops a yokel because the motorist is looking for a certain village, and he asks the yokel the way, and the yokel replies, "I don't rightly know the way, sir, but if I was you, I wouldn't start from here." Well, I'm afraid, in the 18th century, the French, you said the same to the French about New Orleans. And whereas from the Spanish point of view, communications with this part of the world were much more viable from other parts of the Spanish monarchy. And it's not, when I said the Spaniards made a great success of French Louisiana when they took it over by comparison with the French, I didn't mean, the Spaniards, my own ancestors, were wiser or better men and women. They had, big environmental and economic advantages on their side. But they also had this talent for forging key alliances with subject elites. Sir?
If you change the dates and names, have you given this same lecture about the British Empire?
Oh, thank you very much. No, absolutely not. No, because as you know, I mean, the British had neither talent nor interest for forging alliances with indigenous elites. Pretty much when they had the opportunity to do that with Native Americans, they exterminated or expelled them. And when they had an opportunity to do that with their own, as I call them, Creoles, the founding fathers and their ilk at the time of the American Revolution, they absolutely squandered the opportunity. I mean, I'm teaching I was going to say I'm teaching, but I shouldn't say that because my students never learn anything. One of the courses that I'm trying to teach at Notre Dame is about the history of rhetoric, and we look at all these famous speeches of the last 500 years, and these include, speeches by supporters of the American Revolution in Britain, people like the elder Pitt and Edmund Burke, and the leitmotif of these is what our government is doing in our North American colonies is crazy. We should be, using these guys to run the place for us, not interfering with the way they want to do it. And I think that, that is basically where the British made a fatal error. Of course, when I say that they, instead of doing what the Spaniards did with native elites, which was forge these alliances with the key groups, the British expelled and exterminated them. Again, I don't want to give the impression that there was any moral difference between these empires. I mean, my own ancestors were all thoroughly evil. I mean, I come from a long line of utterly immoral ancestors. But of course, the point is that they were working in different circumstances. And it just so happened that the ecology of the regions, most of the regions that fell to the Spanish monarchy in the Americas, were regions where the indigenous population were a vital part of the economic success of Spanish methods of exploitation. So they didn't want to expel those guys because they needed them. And everybody knows that the big failure of the Spanish monarchy was demographic. In the early years, particularly of Spanish settlement, as you know, Native Americans died literally in their millions. Population losses perhaps of 90% in many areas that the Spaniards colonized. And it drove the Spaniards absolutely nuts. They raged against these people for dying because that was the last thing they wanted. They were just very bad at managing the disease environment which was responsible for these deaths, but they really wanted those guys to survive. Not because the Spaniards were nice people and the English were horrible people, but because the Spaniards needed the native labor and the English didn't. That's the crucial difference. So the English had no economic interest in following the Spanish model, at least not once they tried to follow the Spanish model very early on, but once they'd got used to the parts of the peculiar features of the parts of the Americas they were operating in, they abandoned the Spanish model and went in for the expulsion and extermination model instead. But that's not because of their moral inferiority over the Spaniards, it's because of the circumstances in which they found themselves. Oh, I think I might be on the verge of escape. Thank you very much for having me.